For thousands of years, on the island of Ireland, a presence stood tall over the land. She is known in many forms. She is known in many ways, worshipped by all. She is known by many names. Her cult, second only to that of Saint Patrick, her divine femininity, a staple of Irish devotion for millennia. They call her Mary of the Gaels, yet her name is synonymous with goddess. Today, we get to the bottom of her story and find out who she truly is. It began over 2,000 years ago in the shadowed plains of northern Britannia. The Brigantian, proud, fierce and free, stood defiant against the creeping shadow of empire. For years, they rebelled against the might of Rome, but the tide was turning. From the south came the thunder of hooves and iron. The 20th Legion, auxiliaries and cavalry under the ruthless Petilius Ceralius, descended like a storm. With fire and steel, the creeping shadow of Rome grew closer once again. Abandoned by their war goddess Brigantia, the people fled. Druids, warriors, mothers clutching children, all turned to the sea. Beneath low grey skies, they cast off into the unknown, westward, towards the edge of memory. For days they sailed the stormy waters, druids whispering prayers to Manannán mac Ciallair, god of the depths. Hunger gnawed, winds howled, but still they endured. Then gulls, a cry on the wind, and through the mist, land, Ireland. To the people of the southeast, they seemed like ghosts from another age. Strangers, yet familiar. Kin, long lost. But what these exiles brought with them would shape the fate of this land forever. Now, while Brigid and Brigantia are often linked by name, their origins and roles are distinct. Brigantia was worshipped across northern England and parts of the wider Celtic world. Her name, Latinised as Brigantia, derived from the Celtic root brig, meaning high or exalted, marking her as a goddess of sovereignty and divine authority. She appears in inscriptions, not just amongst the Brigantes tribe, who likely took their name from her, but also further afield in the Celtic world, under variants like Brigindo and Brigando. In Ireland, however, a different goddess would arise, Brigid. According to pagan Irish tradition, Brigid was the daughter of the Deada, all-father of the Irish pantheon of gods, called the Tuatha Danann, and Morrigan, the war goddess. But unlike most deities, Brigid is often described as three sisters, each presiding over a different domain, one for healing, one for poetry and traditional learning, and one for smithcraft. These were not random attributes. They reflected the core values of the Druidic order: divine wisdom, healing, and craft. In that sense, Brigid was more than a goddess. She was an ideal, a divine embodiment of the Druidic caste itself. And here's where things get really fascinating. When the Brigantian Druids fled Roman conquest and sought refuge in Ireland, they didn't come with empty hands or empty minds. They brought with them first their warfare to conquer the land, then their religious traditions, including the veneration of Brigantia, their war goddess. But Ireland was already deeply religious. The people worshipped deities like the goddess Danu, a primal earth mother rooted in deep prehistory and the mother of the Tuatha Danann. Tuatha Danann itself meaning tribe of Danu. Also gods like Govnu, the divine smith, and Dian Ceach, the master of medicine. Rather than challenging these established powers, the Druids, both Irish and Brigantian, seem to have taken a different path, one of synthesis. They forged a new goddess, one who could unify their traditions, one who could appeal across tribal lines, one who would prepare the Irish, spiritually and politically, for the growing threat of Rome. Because by the early 70s AD, rumours were spreading. Rome's gaze was shifting westward, and many believed it would take only one legion to bring Hibernia under the eagle. The creation of Brigid was not just theological, but strategic. As scholar Barry Wright states in his book, Brigid, Goddess, Druidess and Saint, this new unifying goddess had to be given a suitable genealogy, a credible Irish parentage, using existing Irish deities. Deada, the All-Father, was chosen as her father, Morrigan, the war goddess, as her mother. Familiar names, both established gods. It was a bridge, constructed by the Druids who saw the need for unity, identity and strength in the face of possible aggression. What we see in Brigid then is not an imported goddess, but a new creation. An Irish goddess, yes, but one born from Brigantian intention. A deliberate fusion of pantheons, politics and beliefs, and her story is only beginning. Brigid, a female sage, was venerated by the Irish as a goddess of smithcraft, filiocht, or poetry, healing and fertility. As Cormac MacCullen, a king bishop of Cashel, wrote in his 10th century chronicle, Cormac's Glossary, Brigid, a poetess, daughter of the Deada. This Brigid is the poetess of the Gael, the goddess whom poets worshipped, because very great and very famous was her protecting care. Her sisters were Brigid, the woman of healing, and Brigid the smith. It is they who are called the three Brigids, whose names were from Brigid. Among all the Irish, a goddess used to be called Brigid. Poetry held a sacred place in Ireland. It was never meant to be diminished to the dramatic and performative arts shoved down our throats in school. Poetry and storytelling, before vlogs and the written word, acted as a vessel for folk memory, identity, religious traditions and law. Druids, bards and filly, under the guidance of the Druidic order, preserved genealogies, recounted victories and shaped the legacy of tribes and chieftains. It's no surprise then, with influence from their hand, that one of Brigid's primary roles was a goddess of poetry and traditional learning. But Brigid's domain extended far beyond the spoken word. Healing, too, was deeply associated with her. In Celtic society, healing was seen as the work of women, drawing from their knowledge of herbs, cooking and domestic ritual. Within the Druidic order, the role of physician was highly respected and likely occupied by druidesses and druids too. Brigid, with her ties to both wellness and traditional knowledge, became the embodiment of this healing power. Her presence meant restoration of body and folk memory. Then there is the forge. Brigid's connection to smithcraft links her to fire, not just the fire of industry but the domestic hearth as well. The hearth was the spiritual centre of the home, a place of warmth, ritual and protection. In both its practical and symbolic forms, fire was revered by the Druids during their many festivals. Fire represented the sun and purity, aspects connected with the goddess and saint, respectively. Her celebration at Imbolg, marking the very beginning of spring, speaks to her role in fertility. In a world shaped by seasonal rhythms, fertility wasn't just symbolic, it was essential. The fertility of crops, of animals, of people was a matter of survival. Brigid's Day was a call for renewal. Druids led rituals on Imbolg, February the 1st, encouraging fertility, so this would have been an important attribute for a goddess who was especially revered by them. And finally, there is the question of magic. While few direct myths survive, linking Brigid the goddess with magical acts, many early miracle tales about the saint bear the hallmarks of older traditions. Tales of endless milk from cows, healing with touch, and fire that does not burn. These are unusual tales for Christian miracles. As mentioned earlier, Brigid's parentage is nothing short of epic. Her father was the Deada, known in Irish tradition as Ochid All-Ahar, meaning the horseman great father or all-father. Aptly named, since Brigid was later beloved by the Fili. The Deada himself was the god of Druidism. He carried a fearsome club. One end could slay and the other could revive, not unlike Thor's Mjolnir in Norse myths. Her mother, the Morrigan, a fearsome war goddess who, according to legend, was impregnated at a stream by the Deada where she was washing the bodies of warriors, prophesied to be killed in future battles. The Morrigan often appears in triple form, as herself, Beibh and Niamh. Celtic scholar Pruntius McKenna of University College Dublin, in his book Celtic Mythology, writes, "Above all, there is a formidable group who have a special claim on the title of Goddess of War. Though often appearing singly, these are normally conceived as a trio, Morrigan, Beibh and Niamh. Since these goddesses are not infrequently identified with one another, the inference is that they are really the triplication of a single deity, and this, in fact, is corroborated by occasional references to the three Morrigans. Beibh, meaning frenzy, may have carried on into modern Irish folklore, downgraded as the Banshee, the death messenger associated with crows. Morrigan is also said to own a herd of otherworldly cattle, linking her symbolically to Saint Brigid, who was frequently associated with cows, vital to the Irish economy at the time. In the Irish saga Town Bo Cuilinne, Morrigan offers her cattle and love to the hero Cuchulainn before his battle. Brigid's divine influences go further. Dian Ceacht, the god of healing and craft, famously restored the arm of King Nuada in the second battle of Moige Turith, allowing him to lead the Tuatha Dé Danann once more. He even revived the fallen, as recorded in Lawer Gabhála Éireann, the Book of Invasions. Then there's Govnu, the smith god, whose trade shaped both peace and war. His name means smith, and he too was part of a divine triad. From these powerful figures, Deada, Morrigan, Dian Ceacht and Govnu, Brigid inherited their essence. She became the ideal goddess for the Druids. Rather than eliminating the pagan beliefs, the early church took approaches that reinterpreted the pagan traditions as Christian and linked to Christian practices. This policy was embodied in the instructions of Saint Augustine, received from Pope Gregory in the early 7th century. He writes, "Because the Anglo-Saxons are accustomed to slay many oxen in sacrifice to demons, some solemnity must be put in the place of this." Early Celtic Christianity wasn't too detached from Druidism. The transition wasn't done by the sword but was more organic. Both traditions shared a moral framework. The Druids distinguished Fós from Neos, the Láthach from Neolachach, upheld by powerful taboos known as Giaisa. Aspects of the spiritual worldview carried over easily. The Druidic belief that spirits filled the landscape translated seamlessly into the Christian ideas of God's omnipresence. The overlap went deeper too. In the early lives of the saints, we see how closely the roles of Druids and early Christian leaders aligned. Both baptized infants and named them. Both observed ritual fires, extinguishing and reigniting them at sacred times. Both were healers, using miracle or magic. Both could transfer illness from people to objects. They foretold the future, taught the youth, led sacred rites, advised kings, and served as bridges between the divine and mortal worlds. Even legendary saints carried echoes of Druidic legacy. Saint Ealhtaid, mentor to the British Saint Samson, was said to descend from a Druidic sage. Saint Bweno's final words were said to be, "The Holy Trinity, the Saints and the Druids." Criven, known as Saint Columcille, had once been a filly of the Druidic order. The filly, a possible subdivision of the Druids, took on Druidic roles as they were the ones who bore the brunt from Christian authorities. In the following millennia, the filly inflated their roles to those also of the bards, whose institutions survived alongside the ecclesiastical authorities. Linguist and former President of Ireland, Dr. Douglas Hyde, in his book Literary History of Ireland, argues that the bardic schools were really a continuation of the Druidic schools and embodied much that was purely pagan in their curriculum. Instances that I've mentioned occurring in the Book of Poets' Instructions are evidently remains of magic incantations and terrifying magic ceremonies, and that the bardic or filly institutions lasted up until the 17th century, when the Irish intelligentsia was smashed by English authorities. The chief druid or druidess may take the name of the deity they venerate. In the case of Brigid's temple in Kildare, the head druidess would have held a name like Brig, meaning high or exalted. In an early edition of the life of Saint Brigid, her birth is foretold by a druid named Morgan, who prophesied the bondmaid Brigantia, courted to a king, would bear a child of great renown. But jealousy stirred in the queen, who, fearing the prophecy, had the bondmaid sold, first to a bard, then to a druid of Tyrconnell. There another prophecy was made. The child would be born at sunrise, not inside nor outside the house, between thresholds, a liminal child, marking Brigid as a being between worlds, pagan and Christian, mortal and divine. The queen, pregnant herself, gave birth to a stillborn, but the newborn Brigid revived the dead infant when placed beside her, a miraculous act strengthening her divinity, akin to the healing prowess of the goddess. When she was older, Brigid travelled with a druid to Connacht, who had a vision of 3 bishops anointing her head with holy oil. The druid who fostered Brigid in a common practice called altram likely taught her as an apprentice. It was under his care that she performed one of her first miracles, causing a cow's milk to flow abundantly, a sign of divine fertility, echoing the Morrigan's otherworldly herd of cattle. There is many sources that point to Brigid being a druidess before she converted. In Expugnatio Hibernica, written in 1185, Gerald of Wales remarks on a tradition, a fire that burned continuously at the church of Saint Brigid in Kildare. The Irish word for Kildare is Kildare, itself meaning Church of the Oak. And that's no coincidence. The oak tree was sacred to the Druids, as a symbol of wisdom, strength, and divine presence. A great oak is said to have stood beside her church, surviving well into the 10th century. Even the 12th century Ren Din Shinkus from the Book of Leinster refers to Brigid as a ban druid, a druidess. At the church there was an eternal fire, symbolising purity and Brigid's fire connection via smithcraft, tended to by druidess with exemption on men entering the fire pit, a tradition also found at temples of her Gaulish counterpart, a goddess called Minerva. Brigid's fire temple at Kildare, prior to Christianisation, would have been akin to a Celtic roundhouse, with a perpetual fire at the centre, a fire that was extinguished by Bishop Henry of Dublin in 1220 AD, to cut down on the veneration of the natural world within the church. The saint's connection with fire via smithcraft and fertility strengthens her connection to the goddess. In many Irish and Scottish traditions on Brigid's Day, the 1st of February, it is said a bed was prepared for her beside the fire, the sacred centre of the home, and food was cooked over the fire in her honour. Other traditions on this day revolved around the hearth, its ashes, and rituals like Beannacha Smalu, Scottish Gaelic for Smoring's blessing, which involves smearing ashes from the fire onto the floor. A 12th century manuscript of the life of Saint Brigid, held in a library at Oxford University, recounts sunlit miracles. that being her cloak hung to dry on a beam of light, a house thought ablaze, found untouched while she slept inside, and a fiery column rising from her head at her consecration. Brigid, it seems, never left the flame. Saint Brigid's Day falls on Imbolc, an ancient pagan festival whose name means in the belly, marking the pregnancy of sheep and the quiet stirrings of spring. It was a time of fertility, both animal and earthbound, when life began to return to the land. Dairy, scarce through winter, was celebrated, with the first milk seen as Brigid's blessing. In the south of Ireland, ashes from the hearth were scattered on fields to welcome the planting season. Scottish stories tells how Brigid, held captive by the winter hag Cailleach, is freed at Imbolc by her brother Angus, the god of youth. In Irish homes, rosaries were said, food left at the doorstep, and Brigid was invited in to bless the family and the land itself. The cross of Saint Brigid is another defining feature of the saint. It is weaved in many ways from straw and rush mostly. As a primary school kid, you probably had to make one like myself did on Brigid's Day Eve. The original tale of the cross involves Brigid weaving her cross from straw taken from the floor to symbolise to a dying pagan chieftain the sacrifice Christ made on the cross, to which the chieftain then converted. How and ever, at St. Brigid's Well in Cliffany, County Sligo, an interesting carving was left from the early Christian period. There is a cross on it, but its upper lines contains a symbol with a swastika-like appearance. The swastika was a solar symbol that developed organically throughout Indo-European society, from ancient Germany to Greece to India. It can also be found in Tibet and Japan, as well as in Native American territories. Truly a symbol of humanity's relation with the sun. Now, when it comes to Brigid's connection with fire via smithcraft, the sun and fire are one of the same. So the symbol in this case would be associated with the goddess as opposed to the saint, and thus was then Christianized under her guise. However, other aspects of the cross uses healing and fertility. There is a story in Ireland of Brigid weaving a cross for her friend who was sick to put above his bed. Not only did it heal his sickness, but prevented sickness going forward in the future. George Story, an English clergyman, records in Newry, County Down in 1689 how all the houses had Brigid's crosses for protections after the devastation left by the Williamite Wars. The Irish National Folklore Commission records that in County Mayo, when a couple got married, the mother-in-law would weave a straw cross, singe the edges and place under the mattress of the couple for fertility reasons. The cross was used as fertility blessings on crops. For example, a Brigid's cross would be put into a basket full of potato seeds when taken out into the fields to be planted. In ancient Celtic Ireland, water was highly venerated. The Celts were known to place valuable items in water for protection purposes. Some would even pilgrimage to sources of water as a chance of renewal. None more infamous in Ireland than the springs of holy wells. Upon the arrival of Christianity, worship of the natural world was impossible to suppress. A canon issued by the Second Council of Arles, 492 AD, stated, "If in the territory of the bishop, infidels light torches or venerate trees, springs, or stones, and he neglects to abolish this usage, he must know he is guilty of sacrilege." Because of this, it was easier for the church to reshape wells and spring sources for Christian practices. One example of this was the construction of churches within their vicinity. Wells belonging to the natural world, of course, came first. Many pilgrimages to wells involved walking sunwise around a nearby sacred tree called the Bille. Given the sacredness of trees in Celtic cosmology, it is irrefutably suggested that this practice was pre-Christian. Many curing or healing wells in Ireland are dedicated to Saint Brigid. In Donegal, Brigid's well was known as Tor Évoch, Eivog's Well, a name of a Celtic deity. Offerings at this well are still left today. The goddess retained her vitality in the saint. In a 2007 paper on Brigid, Carol Cusack, Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Sydney, states, "The goddess was retained in a Christian form. This was a lengthy and complicated transformation, which took place over several centuries. During those centuries, Christianity was becoming enmeshed in the fabric of Irish society. Older models of conversion, positing erasure of the old religion and an uncomplicated acceptance of the new, are simply not credible." The former chief druidess and first abbess of Kildare continued to wield considerable influence and power, and almost certainly was still carrying out customs and services that were concerned with healing, fertility, and blessings, as she did before her conversion. The Christianized tales about the Goddess Brighid became associated with this chief druidess upon her death. Brigid, a goddess of Era, still walks beside us in the form of the saint. To remember the roots of the goddess is not to look back in nostalgia, but to look inwards, to embers that can be restoked. In her, we find the threads that bind ancestry and spirit, hearth and tradition. Reconnecting with her ancient presence could offer not just wisdom, but a quiet healing, a blessing our modern Ireland should joyfully embrace once again.